Good evening, everybody. This is Councillor John Beasley, Chairman of Audit and Governance Committee for BCP Council. Welcome to this additional meeting of the Audit and Governance Committee, in which we have two substantive items which I'll introduce presently. What I'd like to start off with is to ask Democratic Services please to read out the housekeeping notice about how this Skype meeting will be managed. Ms Holyoake.
Thank you, Chairman. Please note that this meeting of the Audit and Governance Committee is being recorded by the Council for live broadcast and will be published on the Council website for a minimum of 6 months. In order to ensure the meeting is managed effectively, please could everyone present follow these ground rules for speaking. Only speak when invited to by the Chairman. State your name before you speak if you have not been introduced by name. Some people may need to dial into the meeting and will therefore not have the benefit of the visual. Mute your microphone when you are not talking. If you would like to speak, please type RTS request to speak in the instant message conversation panel on the left-hand side of your screen and click the arrow button to send. Please note this panel is visible to all parties. If there are any recommendations moved that require a formal vote, these will be carried out by the Democratic Services Officer, asking for a response of for, against, or abstain from each member of the committee. Finally, please ensure background noise is kept to a minimum as far as possible, and mobile phones and other devices are turned off or switched to silent for the duration of the meeting. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much indeed. I'll now just run through, for the benefit particularly of any members of the public who are watching us live streamed, I'll run through the names of those who are present rather than introducing individually. So the members of the Audit and Governance Committee, I think, are all present on this meeting. In addition to myself, we have the Vice Chairman, Councillor Lawrence Williams, together with Councillors Marcus Andrews, Councillor Mike Brooke, Councillor Daniel Butt, Councillor Mike Cox, Councillor Beverly Dunlop, Councillor Simon McCormack and Councillor Mike White. And as I said at the beginning, I think David Brown, portfolio holder, is currently with us, and I think Vicky Slade, Leader of the Council, is either with us or is about to join us. And then in addition to that, we have Councillor Bartlett, and I'll particularly explain his interest in one of the subjects we're looking at this evening. We have amongst the officers, the presenting officers, Graham Farrant, the Chief Executive, Chris Shepherd, the Director for Development, and Martin Tiffin, the Town Centre Vision Programme Leader, together with other officers, Nigel Stannard, Head of Audit and Management Assurance, Adam Richins, Director of Finance, Sean Ballagall, Interim Monitoring Officer, and I've already introduced Jill Holyoake, Democratic Services Officer. And may I say a big thank you to Jill for all your in-depth preparation for this evening's meeting. It is appreciated. I don't think I've missed anybody. No. So there are no apologies or substitute members because we're all present and correct. Could I therefore move on to item 3 on the agenda, which is declarations of interest?
Chair.
I'm just struggling with something on the technology, so if you could verbally interrupt, I'd appreciate it.
Yes, Chair, I sent an RTS to declare an interest. Councillor Mike Brooke. I'm the Council's representative, or what now one of the representatives on the board of BDC, which is being discussed tonight. It is a local interest. I can still take part, and if there is a vote needed, I will be voting.
Thank you very much indeed, Councillor Brooke. I don't have any other RTSs in the conversation panel. There are none. In that case, could we move on to item 4 on the agenda, which is the confirmation of the minutes from our last regular meeting, which was held on the 30th of July at 6 o'clock. Could I do this in two parts? First of all, to get the confirmation from members of the committee that they are a true and accurate record of the meeting. I think I'll take it that everybody agrees, unless you tell me in the conversation panel that you would like to speak on that. I therefore take it that they are a true and accurate record. And the second point is around any matters arising from those minutes. In a moment, I'll have a quick word, if I may, about the Audit and Governance Constitutional Steering Group and how we've moved on that. But are there any others? Most reports, of course, were for noting or to bring back to the next regular meeting of Audit and Governance. Nobody has indicated. I just wanted to update those who are on the committee but not necessarily on the Audit and Governance Constitutional Working Group as to where we were in the process, and indeed for other members who are on this meeting this evening. We met on the 30th, on the 2nd of September, following Audit and Governance on the 30th of July, setting out the terms of the working group. And of course, the meeting on the 2nd of September was essentially there to establish the procedural issues going forward for the working group. And that we did. The first meeting, therefore, of the detailed proposals that are coming forward will take place on the 23rd of September. I suspect that it will take 2 or 3 meetings to achieve that. And the suggestions that have come forward for discussion will essentially be planning issues. There are only 1 or perhaps 2 others apart from that. And of course, the relevant head of service and indeed chairman of planning and indeed also others who may have input to it will be invited to attend that meeting. The items we're looking at are the ones which came back to me when I canvassed all members of the council and sent them a reminder about any issues that might be discussed by any of the 76 members of the council. And in turn, Democratic Services have put those onto a spreadsheet so that we can see the detail and work our way through it. And I think once we've got into that process, we may well do another trawl of the council to see whether there are any other issues that members want to raise for the working group to look at. And my proposal will be that I will ask Democratic Services to receive those and to collate a schedule of any others that come through. And I think that should work and make the procedure more efficient than it would otherwise be. And I hope that members of Audit and Governance will agree that that is a sensible way forward. Are there any comments? None have been raised. So I will coordinate between myself and the chair and vice chair of the working group. That's Councillor Williams and Councillor Butt, so that we can get through the process as quickly and efficiently as we can, whilst at the same time being as thorough as I know we'll all want to be. So in terms of there are no matters arising from those minutes of A&G on the 30th of July. Could I move that they be received, be accepted? Is everybody in agreement with that? If not, please could you indicate? No, in that case, those minutes are confirmed. Item 5 is public issues, and I understand no public issues have been received for this meeting. That then takes us on to the two substantive items that we have before us. And these are, again, items which have come forward from members of Audit and Governance as ones whereby we will have presentations which will probably last between 10 and 15 minutes each, following which most of the time will be devoted to a Q&A session for members of the committee. I think it probably works best if we talk about and ask questions of officers on items within the two categories that are of a special interest to members of the committee. And so we have two presentations. One is around the structure and operation of the Bournemouth Development Company, and that was brought forward by Councillor Steve Bartlett, very much supported by myself as well. And I know that Steve has had a number of issues that he wanted to be raised. I hope that officers will cover this in their presentation in a moment. And then the other presentation, which will be coming forward to us, will be one on the review of the organisational and operational structure of BCP Council, and that presentation will be made by the Chief Executive. Again, it'll probably be about 10, maybe 15 minutes, and then a wholesome amount of time left over for questions and answers from members of the committee. So without further ado, could we move on to item 6 on the agenda, which is the presentation, introduction and presentation of the structure and operation of the Bournemouth Development Company. I think Chris Shepherd, the Director of Development, will introduce the item, and then the programme leader, Martin Tiffin, will be making the presentation. So over to you, Mr. Shepherd.
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening, everybody. I will put on my video just so I'm being polite and to prove I'm actually here, although I'm on leave today, so excuse the casual attire and excuse any children interruptions because it's children's bedtime as well. So hopefully we'll get through this without being too interrupted. I am indeed going to introduce this paper, but then I'll quickly hand over to Martin. I guess just for me to say thanks for the opportunity to talk about it, and it's something that I know the committee's been looking at and thinking about for a while, so we really appreciate that opportunity. Please bear with me while I share the screen. We're going to try and do this as a double act, and then I'll introduce Martin in a minute. So hopefully this will all be fine, and I will try and share my screen. Bear with me. So, Chairman, perhaps you could confirm you could see that slide.
Just come up, yes. It's
okay.
The one headed BDC Governance with Martin Tiffin's name on it.
That's it, that's the one. So I am going to lead on and introduce Martin, who many of you will know, I'm sure. Martin's been working for the council for a number of years, quite some while actually, and has really built this himself with others over the years and knows it intimately. So he'll be the best person to take you through this slide deck. So hopefully out there in the ether, Martin is there. Come in, Martin.
Can you hear me, Chris?
I can. There you go. This is perfect. It's like Eurovision, isn't it?
It is like Eurovision.
Oh, wait. Over to you, Martin.
Okay. Okay. Firstly, Martin Tiffin. Some of you will know Beverly in particular. You know, we first met in 2008 when we were talking about all things about the town centre vision and about how we kind of bring things forward. And I'd say, as Chris said, I've been involved intimately with helping to deliver the town centre vision, and at the same time specifically came in from the private sector to essentially help look at various delivery options for bringing forward development in our town, and which then effectively brought into being after quite a lengthy procurement process, a public procurement process, which led to the formation of Bournemouth Development Company. Chris, can you go to the next slide, please? So what is BDC? I mean, it's quite interesting actually that you know, I read lots of things about BDC, and I hear lots of things about BDC, and it's obviously is well publicised within the local community. I think the main thing to kind of bring about is, or to introduce the thing, is what is BDC? It is not a, talking in a slightly legalistic sense, it's not a limited liability company. It's not a partnership. Those are distinct sorts of ways of operating a business and in this case, a development vehicle. What we have is a limited liability partnership, which is effectively an amalgam of the two concepts, and almost in some respects a hybrid. The beauty of the LLP structure, and one of the reasons why we chose it early on as the modus of operating BDC, was that we could create essentially bespoke internal governance arrangements. And what that enabled us to do was to carve out all of the kind of decision making that is needed to bring projects from inception right through to delivery, sales, and all the rest of it, in such a way that it kind of, as much as it could do, aligned to the council's own internal processes. Chris, can I go on to the next slide, please? So why did we form BDC? These are four things that just sprung to mind, thinking back in 2008 when we set it up. There was an element of kind of market failure. What I mean by that was that obviously everyone will recall that time that essentially the financial markets were in turmoil, and that brought a lot of things down with it. But also the market failure was down to the fact that we'd looked at the more traditional routes of bringing forward development in our town in the so-called boom time of 2002 to 2007, the so-called boom time in the property sector. And although we'd entered into more conventional type agreements, subject to planning deals on lands on key sites, in particular the pavilion site, the winter garden site, the site next to the BIC, the hotel training school site, none of those schemes were delivered. So we took that into account. The other thing was we wanted to look at our sort of, how could we control our own destiny? And what I mean by this is that traditionally councils have the ability to control an element of development through the planning process, but sometimes the planning process can be a bit blunt. And so with this particular mechanism, it allowed us to have a bit more say in the key decisions that essentially you need to have in order to get agreement on to bring schemes forward. So it gave us a seat at the table when all the key decisions were being made about what type of development was going to come forward, how it was going to come forward, the pace, and all those types of things that are important to us as custodians of the town. The other thing was we wanted to create a structure which captured the fruits of developments, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail in the latest slide. Chris, next one, please. So how does it work? In really simplistic form, it can be seen to people that are not familiar with sort of the development process, or how you get from, from stage one of a concept design through to actually, the physical building being developed. Is we essentially came up with three processes of kind of making decisions. The first one is ultimately a development manager. So in this case, we have Morgan Sindall Investments acting as a development manager. They kind of make the day-to-day decisions about the development process in terms of appointing the consultants, in terms of they've got the knowledge of how to do that. The next tier is what we call the BDC Partnership Board. And this is where it's made up of the two parties that have kind of joined together. At the current point in time, we have 3 elected councillors that sit on the board and 2 representatives from Morgan Sindall. The third tier, and this is probably the most important tier, it's kind of the top of the tier in terms of decision making, is what we call LLP Member Approval. And so what we've done is we've essentially carved out all of the decisions that need to be made in order to get development underway and completed. And what we've done is we've kind of set those decisions at a level where we felt it is appropriate in order for that particular body to make that kind of decision. So in its simplest form, The development manager essentially, helps with the design development process. It decides whether we build 2-bedroom flats, 3-bedroom flats, whatever the case may be, because they have the industry experience. The board essentially sits there as the kind of arbiter in making sure that decisions made by the members at the high level are essentially implemented. Next slide, please, Chris. So a bit more about the development manager role. Why did we effectively bring in a development manager? Essentially, the reason being is we needed industry experience, because essentially, although this is a 50-50 joint venture, we have to be realistic, is that people within the council do not necessarily have the industry experience in order to bring forward development at the early sort of concept stage and help us get through that journey. And the thing about Morgan Sindall Investments, they're part of a much bigger sort of outfit, Morgan Sindall Group, and they have 6,000 employees. And what do? They do development, they do construction. They're a big, well-known, recognised name in the marketplace. So we use them as our kind of development manager. They have delegated authority to do certain things, and that is documented in essentially the delegations policy within the overarching members agreement. On certain matters, they essentially seek guidance and approval of the BDC Partnership Board. So while they're doing the day-to-day stuff, there are certain matters that have to come back to the board for approval. Next slide, please, Chris. So the Partnership Board role. The key thing about the 3 key things really is that it has to make sure that it essentially acts on the decisions that have been given to it by what we call the LLP members. In our case, as a council, the council decisions. So it must make sure that where the council has been quite specific in its decision-making process, that essentially BDC kind of follows those decisions within its delegated authority. The other key thing about the board is it must act in the best interest of BDC. Now, BDC has essentially 4 overriding business objectives. The 4 objectives are in no particular order or priority, but essentially they are: 1, to promote regeneration of the area; 2, to bring forward buildings of good quality and design; 3, to ensure that there's actual delivery, so that we take a project essentially from the cradle to the grave; and 4, that essentially the returns to the members are in line with the business plan and the site development plan, which are approved by Cabinet. Next slide, please, Chris. So a little bit more about the LLP member role. It's a bit like looking at it as having a company with 2 shareholders. We call them members in the legal parlance, and that's the Council of Morgan Sindall. When the council is making decisions in relation to BDC, it acts in its own interest for making the decisions. Unlike the board acts in the interest of BDC. There's a distinct difference there. The other thing about it is that essentially we created by design a deadlock vehicle. And the reason for that was that we needed to create something that we've got both parties to kind of agree on a kind of a way forward, and essentially it also kind of promotes a consensus. So you can't have one party have an overriding vote on another. The other thing about the member role is that we have decided as a council that essentially we make our decisions via a cabinet decision, and therefore there's an element of open and transparency in that process. Other matters, because of the way that the council is set up, require full council approval, and some of you will be aware that full council approval was required for some matters connected with the Wintergarden scheme. If we look at it, the LLP from Morgan Sindall's perspective, they set up their own kind of governance arrangements for them as members of the LLP to make their decisions. So they'll have their own internal governance structure as well to deal with in order to get their necessary member approval. The other thing about the member role is when we were setting out the delegations policy, i.e. what the board can decide, what the development manager can decide, and what the members decide, we wanted to make sure that when it came to all the big decisions, that these were being made at member level. So item 6 there, the key things we sign off in practical terms is we sign off the BDC business plan, we sign off the site development plan, and what I haven't got in there is that when we get towards the just about to start on site, essentially the council signs off on what we call the site's lease value, and the next slide will explain a bit more about that. So can you move to the next slide, please, Chris? So the financial case, sorry, I've financial case here. I just wanted to touch upon why we kind of decided in terms of going down this particular joint venture route as opposed to a kind of a straightforward land disposal route. And I think the easiest way to describe this is kind of in terms of the financial aspects is a very, very simplistic development appraisal. So if we kind of look at the figures on the left-hand side, you'll see that we have a scheme which has a gross development value of £15 million. It has a development cost of 9.4 million, and it has a gross profit of 3.1 million pounds. So in that scenario, if we disposed of the land on a subject to planning deal, and essentially the developer in this instance exercised the option from us and bought the land from us, we would receive 2.5 million pounds under this example. The thing that we don't ensure with that is whether we get certainty of delivery. Okay. The next column is how we do it through sort of joint development. So once again, the same headline number in terms of gross development value, the same land cost, the same gross profit. Here we have an extra line of cost. We have essentially a central overhead for running BDC. Which the way that it's structured under our arrangement comes out of the development profits. That's how those costs are met. So the first line that comes off of the kind of profit level is essentially that cost. So that will reduce the kind of gross profit that's available for distribution by, in this case, £100,000. That means that there are essentially £3 million that is available for division between the two joint venture parties. And so in this case, the net return from the to the council is, using this simple, very, very simple example, is £4 million. Okay, but also importantly from the joint development approach, is that we ensure delivery as well. So not only do we get a higher return, but we also ensure delivery on the ground. Next slide, please, Chris, which I think hopefully is my last slide. So does it work? I think this is an interesting one, and I think it depends how you look at it. In many, many respects, in my mind, it has worked. If we look back to 2002, 2007, we were unable to get development underway in our town. There were a whole raft of reasons for that. When we got to about 2015, 2016, we were recognised as the town with the third most development activity outside of London. And that's an accolade in itself to the kind of the effort that was put in by lots and lots of people to get to us that point. And it wasn't just BDC, it was basically BDC as a number of delivery mechanisms. We all know that the university was on a big expansion program in the town centre. There were lots of private sector development developers looking to get into the town that had, basically been trying for a number of years to get some traction. And it's an amalgam of all of those three different delivery routes that essentially got us to where we were in 2015, 2016. And a lot of us can remember only 4 or 5 years ago the number of tower cranes that we have had up in the town centre and the number of tower cranes that we have seen in the Lansdowne area. Some people have asked why deadlock. I suppose being a lawyer, I could kind of give you a legalistic answer about why we set out the kind of the deadlock structure, but I think I've seen in practice that it kind of promotes consensus to move forward. Regeneration is not a 2 to 4 year game. It is a 5 to 12 to 15 to 20 year game. Yeah, BDC has been set up to deliver on 16 sites initially. That was the phase 1 sites. The ability to add in more sites is built into the system. It's a 20-year vehicle. We're 9 years in. We've got 11 to go. To be brutally honest, I would have hoped we were a bit further advanced than where we are, but we have achieved a lot in a short period of time. We're now embarking a very interesting stage as we take on arguably one of the largest, public-private partnership type projects on a single site in a town centre, and that's the £150 million Winter Garden scheme, which a lot of you will know that have been a long time in the council. We have had aspirations as a council for over 20 years to develop that site. We have entered into a number of development agreements with a number of other parties in that time. BDC is now having a go, and it's getting extremely close, and the building blocks to get us to site are almost there. I think that concludes me. Hopefully I've done it in the time frame. Over to questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Tiffin, and thank you to Mr. Shepherd. It's exactly the presentation that I was hoping we would have, on the basis that it gives a good outline of what has gone before and what the BDC is there to do. In this Q&A session, it's an opportunity for members to get under the skin of the issues which they're particularly interested or concerned about, because that seems to work best. So it was Councillor Bartlett who brought this suggestion to me in the first place, backed up actually by other members. Who would like to start on questions? Could I perhaps, I haven't had anybody indicate, could I perhaps ask you, Councillor Bartlett, if you'd like to kick this part off?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Let me just do this one. Yeah, I guess what really sort of asked me to get this on the agenda was that the BDC is very important for the regeneration, and it's had some successes, and that's well acknowledged, but it is a fairly complex arrangement with contractually between Morgan Sindall and the council, and there are a couple of things that come through on the papers that you see that sort of make you question the value for money aspects of the agreement, and whether the other options which Martin has just alluded to in terms of the open market, by comparison, which ones may offer the best value for money to the council, to the taxpayer. Now, clearly, there's some real benefits in terms of place setting, control, getting what you want where you want it, etc. And it has worked very, very well. But the value for money in terms of financial return is one that I haven't understood. I don't think members generally understand how it works. And it's such an important issue because it may well be that this model is the one that should be used, taking our regeneration through the conurbation. And I think it's important that we really understand the model that's being used, and particularly in terms of its value for money. So I think one of the issues for me was also about transparency. Can we really see what the value for money is? Can we really understand what the returns to the council are? The business appraisals that are put forward for approval, do we really understand what's underneath those and what it's really telling us? And I've been trying to do some work on this as a preliminary to this meeting since January, and I've not really been able to make a lot of progress with it, and I'll come on to the reasons for that later. But I guess coming to the specifics of the questions, I guess the first question I've got is, do we get value for money from the arrangement between Morgan Sindall and the council? Is it equitable in financial terms? So I'm not quite sure. I think maybe that's probably a question for Chris Shepherd, and I wondered if he could perhaps explain why this model does provide value for money in terms of in financial terms, and he's able to.
Mr. Shepherd.
Councillor Bartlett. Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I will give it my best effort. Yes, I believe that it does, because as Martin explained, you look at the financial case, and you can see that in that particular example, the returns outweigh the in the joint development option outweigh the disposal option. So I followed that quite clearly with Martin, and I thought that made sense. So that would be my answer to you, Councillor Bartlett. I'm sure there's more technical reasons and more technical answers to that, but I think the other point to make, and I know you've talked about value for money. I think I've answered your question by showing you by going back to that slide, which I can show again if you'd like. But I also think that the other point here is about what you get out of it, and the fact that you will get a development and a regeneration out of that. And I think that does come back to the value for money question a bit, because you would include council tax or business rates or both in that appraisal, or in that outcome, not necessarily in the appraisal, but in the outcome.
Councillor Bartlett, do you want to come back at all?
Yes, if you don't mind, Chair. I've got probably 2 or 3 questions I would like to ask if I'm allowed to.
If I could deal with all of yours together, I think that would be a good idea. Then I'll bring other members in after I've done that.
Yeah, thank you. Getting right to the nitty gritty of it, then I guess is the issue that has really been troubling me is the one of residual land value, and how that's taken into account in the development appraisal model. And it's quite clear to me, having looked at it, that if you put in a land value which is probably more tuned with what a market value for the council site would be, assuming planning consent is given, the residual land values that are assigned in the development appraisal are set very low, and the Durley Road car park is an example of that. And if you remodel those appraisals with what you might consider to be a more realistic residual land value, you actually get an appraisal that comes out at a loss. Now, my concern here is, and it's a question for you, is that I'm not sure if the returns to Morgan Sindall through the partnership are fixed in terms of the profit margins, and in order to achieve those, the bit that has to suffer if those can't be achieved is a reduction in the land value. So, and I've done some modelling on the appraisal for Durley Road car park today, and in fact, you can show very easily that the financial return is not good. It's probably not a viable development if you use a slightly increased land value. So I wondered if you'd like to comment on that, please, Chris.
I will say one thing, Councillor Bartlett. I mean, I will pass over to Martin for the technical answers to this, but what I would, and why I think you've been going with some of the questions, is about your concerns about whether Morgan Sindall's stake in this is equitable or not. And this, as Martin explained, this is a 50-50 vehicle between ourselves and Morgan Sindall. So any profit that's in there is profit that's shared by both of us. So it's not about them taking more profit or having a profit margin that they can't stick to, and then eating into our costs. This is about a vehicle that we're both happy with, and there's a 50-50 deadlock vehicle that means neither of us can go forward without the other. So I just wanted to clear that point up. I think I will pass over to Martin on the residual land value. You do make a really valid point there, but I will ask him to respond on that one if that's okay.
Do you want me to share my can you see
Do you
me?
want me to share a screen, Martin?
No, that's fine. Let me just my face up. Okay. Right, couple of points. Firstly, the level of profit is something that is essentially agreed by the partnership board representatives. And to date, all of the BDC schemes have basically been brought forward with a less than market level of profit. Okay, what that does is essentially ensure that there is unnecessary erosion of essentially the site lease value. As you're probably aware, any public body that essentially seeks to dispose of an asset needs to essentially show best consideration, and that's enshrined in Section 123 of the Local Government Act. And when we determine the site lease value, it is essentially a market valuation based on what we call the Red Book. The Red Book is the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors kind of valuation Bible. And essentially what we do is a Red Book analysis by the Section 123 valuer. And essentially what he does is he takes into account all of the things that are known to him at that point in time. So unusually under the BD structure, and we did this by design, is we do not undertake that Red Book valuation until all of the things that make development uncertain, for example, the construction costs, the finance cost, has it got planning, what's the level of Section 106, are there any additional highways mitigation measures, Section 278 stuff and all that sort of stuff, yeah? Takes that into account. And then we essentially check that against the development appraisal that is produced by BDC. And more often than not, when you apply a market level of profit, yeah, the residual land value under a Red Book analysis is less than essentially we're getting through the kind of the BDC mechanism. And so we've built all these measures into essentially our kind of contractual structure. So you're right, it's complex, but it's complex because we foresaw at the time that we were developing the BDC model that we needed to consider essentially things like value for money, best consideration and the like. And those things are very much enshrined not only within the procedures, but also enshrined within the contractual documentation.
Thank you, Mr. Tiffin. Did you say you had two other points, Councillor Bartlett?
Yeah, could I just come back on that one, if I may, Chair?
Yeah, I do have other people wanting to come in though, so
okay.
I'm not trying to speed
so
you up, I just want to make sure they get
I asked two specific questions there, but just summarising all that then, it's probably correct to say that the profit margins for Morgan Sindall are fixed by the agreement and they're maintained by the variation of the residual land value on the land value when the development has been completed.
No, can I just correct you there? No, the level of profit is not fixed, and it is basically determined by the partnership board. Has to be because of deadlock vehicle agreement, and it's on each specific project because the development profit is intended to essentially remunerate the two members of the vehicle for the risk it takes. So some schemes, yeah, are less risky than others, and therefore essentially the profit level is reduced accordingly. So to give you an example, if you do an open market sales scheme, then essentially it's more risk in it because you effectively got to then build them, sell the flats and all the rest of it, or whatever you've built, than where you have already agreed in advance an end purchaser that is agreeing to buy the whole shooting match at practical completion. So look at the Berry Court deal, yeah, the profit level on that scheme was different than you would ordinarily expect in an open market sales scheme because we had sold the completed building before we started on site at a set price. So therefore the board agreed what was the appropriate profit margin for that type of risk profile. So it's not agreed and it's not basically set in stone. It's subject to negotiation and agreement between the two representatives of the partnership.
Okay, it's again, for the layman, it's very difficult to understand when a residual value of 0 is given against the Winter Gardens development and an extremely low valuation is given to the residual land value for the Durley Road car park scheme. And even when you add the predicted profits to that, the sum of those is still less than what the market value of that site would be in the open market with planning consent. But let me just take you to the next question, if I may, and that is, how does the Section 115 officer ensure that the best consideration is achieved for the disposal of the land asset? How does he do that, and is that being achieved?
Councillor Beasley, do you want me to respond to that as a Section 151 officer? I can't hear you, Councillor Beasley.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. Thank you, Councillor. Thank you, Mr. Richards.
Okay, thank you. So in response to you, I think it comes back to the judgment of value for money. Because value for money is a subjective assessment of actually, if you like, cost, quality, and that overall usefulness to the customer. And clearly, what the council's getting out of this is the development. Because in a lot of situations where you talk about potentially negative land values, one assumes that if the council just sat back, and then the development wouldn't happen because nobody would bring it forward, because they would be making a loss if they were paying any kind of land value for that asset. So, what the council's got to take into account in this overall judgment is not only is it getting a land value, is it getting a profit, but it's also getting the development. And it's a complicated arrangement in that overall assessment, that actually it's receiving, all parts of that equation and assessing all parts of that equation in determining whether or not it's achieving that value for money aspect.
Thank you, Chair. I assume, and Mr. Richards is confident that the best value or best consideration is being achieved for the Durley Road development, and I think I'll probably leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Bartlett. Councillor Cox.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've got a few questions, some of them technical, some of them not so technical. The first one is in terms of the partnership agreement between Morgan Sindall and BCP. I'm assuming that's pretty detailed, and is that public? Is it a public document that anybody can have a look at? Certainly when you have an articles of association of a company, those tend to be public, whereas LLPs tend to be private. So I would just, in these circumstances, I personally prefer if it was a public document. The second technical question is really to do with the membership and tax. My understanding, certainly when LLPs first were set up, they didn't need to be a real person as a member, but I thought that had changed recently, and I thought that a real person had to be a member, but that maybe Adam can advise me on that one. In terms of the other non-technical items, I also have a problem with the about who values the land, and I think Mr. Tiffin and others have said how that is done. I have some reservations, however, as to whether actually BCP are really getting value for money on the sale of the land, because it strikes me that it is being manipulated down so that the profits of the scheme can be acceptable to the developer. Now, as far as I can see, Morgan Sindall seems to be on a no-lose situation. And if this is a real partnership, then surely that they should take the profits as take the losses as well as the profits. And I certainly got the impression, having listened to the presentation and some of the explanations later on by Mr. Tiffin, is that they were on a no-lose situation. and that didn't seem particularly right to me, because we appeared to be taking all the risks, whereas they weren't taking the risks. Another point I would like to make is that although it is a 50-50 partnership, and that we did, in terms of the board, the LLP board, we seem to have a majority. It's a matter of who's controlling that and who's got the knowledge of that. It's all very well them having 50% and us having 50%, but if we don't have the knowledge of what's going on behind the scenes, then actually, in terms of the balance of power between those two sides, then they have it. They have all the balance of power. They have all the knowledge, and they could, if they were so inclined, manipulate the position to their benefit without ordinary councillors. And I don't mean to disparage whoever is our representatives on there, and apart from Councillor Brooke, who has declared an interest. I have no idea who the other councillors are. But in terms, this is a particularly complicated legal and accounting setup, and are we qualified to do that? Don't get me wrong. I actually think this structure is really good and will benefit BCP in the long run. Just have certain concerns about where the risks are and who's getting value for money. And I suppose that as a final point, I would just to say, has there been any, from a BCP's perspective, has there been any value for money audits on this at all in the last 9 years or wherever? Because I think it's probably overdue if there hasn't been. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Cox. I think a couple of those may be ones that Mr. Richins might want to respond to, although there was some legal in there as well. So perhaps Sian Ballingall may have a comment to make, and then perhaps revert back to either Mr. Shepherd or Mr. Tiffin for the other issues. Mr. Richins, would you like to start us off?
It might be best if you go to Sian first with regards to, because I think some of those questions that were indicated potentially financial, probably more legal. But I think we do keep coming back to this overall reflection on value for money, and as I said before, value for money is a subjective judgment. It is a subjective judgment based on, actually in this equation, actually the land value, the profit and the development. And I think, as Martin showed in his presentation, there were two scenarios: just straightforward sale, you get the land, but you might not get that land value and you might not get development if there's not enough profit in it for the developer as part of that process. Whereas in joint vehicle scenario, you actually manage to create that development, you manage to proceed with that development, and that actually helps the town with its regeneration objectives, and therefore, in that value for money assessment, we need to always bear that in mind. What I'm always acutely aware of in these kind of deals is that the council gets £1, a penny, a pound in a pound by way of the land value, but it gets 50p in the pound with regards to actually the profit. So I'm always keen for that land value to be as high as possible, because the council captures all of it, whereas clearly we only get 50% in the profit. But with that kind of introduction from me, can I pass on to Sian for maybe some of those legal aspects?
Ballingall.
Hi. Turning to the legal provisions of the members' agreement, we do have good in-house understanding of the provisions in that agreement, and we're able to work effectively with the agreement. There are some, it's right that it's a very complicated document. I've got a copy of it here. There are several schedules to the agreement, and it wouldn't be helpful, I don't think, for anyone here in the meeting for me to try to summarise the key provisions of that in this meeting, but certainly I'm happy to follow up with advice on any particular questions that anyone may have. One thing I will say about the valuation point in terms of the residual land value is that there is a specific provision built into the agreement that recognises that if there is to be a transaction at an undervalue, the appropriate consent would need to be sought if that land value under value were to exceed a certain threshold level, at which point Secretary of State consent is required. And as I say, that is a mechanism picked up in the agreement already.
Thank you very much for that. Could I then revert to either Mr. Shepherd or Mr. Tiffin for the other points raised by Councillor Cox?
Do you want me to go ahead, Chris?
I'm happy for you to do that, Martin. Thank you.
Okay, right. Okay, taking them one by one. The members' agreement, which is a bit like a shareholders' agreement between the company, you're right, it's a private document, but we do essentially disclose that to any interested party that essentially makes an FOI request. And I think in the early days, probably within the first 6 months of us setting up BDC, we had 35 to 40 requests for a copy of that agreement, mainly, if I would say, from other law firms, other councils who were very interested to see what we've done and how we did it. And I think that's kind of led the template that we set up in Bournemouth has been, as I say, replicated many times. And that was basically people getting hold of the documentation that we produced. We must remember that we went through a very extensive procurement process to set up BDC. We received £500,000 grant from what was then the Regional Development Agency on the basis that we looked at this new form of structure for bringing forward development, but that if successful and we got past, signing on the dotted line, bear in mind this is one of the first to ever be set up, that we would share it, and we have done that. And probably in my time at the council, I've probably entertained 40 to 50 different councils about understanding how the structure works. So that is available. In terms of the risk, it's an interesting one you say there, that essentially the council's taking all the risk. The structure is very much trying to allocate risk to the party that's best to kind of manage it. So when we set out on this journey in 2008, 2009, we had no development in our town, and we had lots of people promising lots of different things. We'd entered into agreements and that sort of stuff. So we were very conscious that we wanted to get something that gave us delivery. And so the risk profile was very much in the early stages passed on to Morgan Sindall. So all of the money that essentially goes in to basically get these schemes through the planning process is funded by Morgan Sindall. They don't get a penny back, not one penny, unless that scheme gets to site and they essentially get to practical completion. So they're carrying a huge element of that, during the risk profile. I think the third point you made was about knowledge in terms of, you're right, we've entered into a contract with Morgan Sindall. They employ 6,000 people. All they do is put a brick on a brick, And I suppose that's kind of my role in some respects, So you need to understand a little bit about my role. I've been in the development game now for 40 years. I have been a lawyer. I've worked for a tier 1 contractor. I've been a design engineer. I've been involved in quantity surveying and what have you. And I've probably in my time closed over £15 billion worth of transactions. I kind of understand the development process, and I kind of understand what Morgan Sindall do. I used to work for an organisation like that, as I say, for 11 years. I worked for John Lang. And I worked on some of the biggest infrastructure projects that we were doing in the 1980s. So I have a reasonably good understanding about kind of what they do and how they go about it. And I am the council's I check the process, and I kind of make sure that everything is as it should be. And that's what I'm paid to do, and that's my job. So that's where there's an element of knowledge. And you're right, the board of representatives is made up of people that don't necessarily have the same level of experience as Morgan Sindall. And kind of my role is to help those people understand their role in terms of the governance arrangements and where they sit in the process, but also to essentially make sure that the council, in terms of Section 151 officer, is happy, the monitoring officer is happy, and that we're following due process. So hopefully that will give you a bit of confidence that we have a good understanding of how they go, how Morgan Stanley will go about it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tiffin. I have just one other member wishing to ask a question. No, it's now two. And then I'd like to, if we can, move on, because we're going to run out of time on the Chief Executive's presentation if we're not careful. So, Councillor White. Councillor White.
You, Chairman, I've just unmuted. Can you hear me?
I can now, yes.
Yeah, brilliant. I thought Councillor Bartlett and others have actually made some excellent points in relation to VFM. I think some of the answers we've had don't totally address the point. Where officers have referred to the what was actually a purely theoretical example in the presentation we were given, and the fact that, you know, somewhere in the difficult equation which covers all this, we actually control development. I mean, I would like to see some sort of analysis or audit of the financial and VFN position in relation to the projects we've actually undertaken, if that's possible. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor White. Point noted. It was a point also made by Councillor Bartlett, and I think it does have some merit. Who'd actually like to answer that from the officer team?
Well, I suppose that's probably me, Chair.
Yes,
as to the question is whether we do or don't do an audit on it. Is that I guess that's the question that's being asked.
That is the question, yes.
And I suppose the answer is, if that's what members would like, then we will endeavour to achieve such an audit.
Thank you very much. And perhaps you and I could coordinate about timing and so forth outside of the meeting, and then I can report back to members of Audit and Governance once we've made some progress. Would that satisfy Councillor White?
Yeah, excellent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Andrews.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I've got two questions, one a sort of technical one, then one more of a sort of policy question. The first one is about the valuations, Red Book valuations, everything like that. As somebody's been doing these valuations for 40 odd years, probably even before the Red Book was first published, I do know about valuations. In fact, I have probably valued properties for all the local authorities in the area where they've actually probably needed some independent outside valuation advice. So my question is, who actually is doing these valuations? I know on planning matters, the district valuer is employed to do the valuation, so it's somebody else independent, as it were. Are these valuations being done by BCP staff, or are we employing an external valuer? So that's that question. And then the other question, which I'll pose now, which could be dealt with by somebody else, is more of a sort of general matter. This afternoon we had a meeting with a police inspector who said on policing division boundaries, yes, they're still following Poole Borough boundaries, Bournemouth Borough Council boundaries, but he's going to review it and change it to adhere to BCP boundaries. Obviously, this company is called Bournemouth Development Company, and it is at the moment looking at Bournemouth Council old car parks. Obviously, this is a policy matter for the council members probably to consider, but obviously there are lots of underutilised car parks in Poole, probably some in Christchurch. Is this a situation that in the long term, once, hey, you've run out of Bournemouth Council old car parks, we're going to look at other car parks in the BCP area? Thank you.
You're on mute, Councillor Beasley.
Councillor Beasley, you're on mute, I'm afraid.
My apologies, schoolboy error. The first of those questions I think probably best answered by Mr. Tiffin around valuations, and then perhaps the second question, Mr. Shepherd. So, Mr. Tiffin, could you start us off?
Yes. So, in terms of the valuations, yes, it's a combination of during the planning process, the valuations for essentially for Section 106 contributions is typically done by the District Valuer's Office, and obviously that process is common to all developments coming forward. When we have been discharging Section 123 valuations, we have used external practices, and I think we used Civic Gregory in the past. I think we've used others, but yes, we do basically do that as externally for people who have experience, like yourself, Mark, in relation to Red Book valuations. I know you've asked Chris to give a response, but I would like to make some comments about the wider opportunities. But
I was
Chris
looking,
I
think, the sort of strategic direction, I think, was what Councillor Andrews was after, but by all means, both of you.
Martin, shall I just quickly set the scene, and then you can add some colour? So yes, obviously we've been thinking about that too, Councillor Andrews, and as I believe as we became BCP Council, contracts obviously across the board novated over from the previous authorities into BCP, but that didn't change the agreements that we have for the Bournemouth Development Company, in the sense that you're right, it's named the Bournemouth Development Company, and we wanted to look at that in more detail. As it happens, we have a cabinet paper destined for cabinet in October, which is a follow-on from the signing off of the business plan in earlier in the year, which highlighted Chapel Lane car park in Poole as a potential location, and that's something that's being explored through the cabinet process, and indeed Martin has literally just finished, I think, writing a draft of that tonight. So we are exploring those avenues and looking to see what's possible. Martin, do you want to add some more to that?
Yes, I think what's quite interesting is back in 2008, 2009, when we were looking at setting up BDC and going to the marketplace, we always kind of saw the opportunity that if things went well, that essentially there's no reason why, because it's a separate legal entity, that it could not go and do development kind of elsewhere, if you sort of mean. And we specifically provided for a procedure within the contractual framework, and was very much some of the issues that we dialogued during the competitive dialogue process about adding in additional sites. There is a procedure that needs to be followed in order for additional sites to basically be injected into BDC, and as Chris highlighted, we will test that procedure and see whether that offers the appropriate route for helping bring forward development in Poole.
Thank you, Mr. Tiffin. Final question from Councillor Bartlett.
Thank you, Chair. Just to pick up on Councillor Marcus's point about valuations, and also the agreement to do a value for money audit, I really welcome this. I've been trying to get information on the independent valuation since January, and I've not had all the information that I've been looking for, so this will presumably show up in that audit, which is very welcome. The other thing, I'd just like to come back on Mr. Richin's point about the overall aspects of a development. It's not all about money, it's about the other things. And I have to go back to the Durley Road development again, because here we have one that is not a regeneration project. It's being carried out purely for profit. I am absolutely certain that that would not produce any profit without reducing the real market value of that land site considerably. Now, I know the decision's been made, but I hope that the audit will look specifically at that. The site is not offering any affordable housing, and if you look at the social aspects of it, there's very little in there, and almost any developer would bite your hand off to buy that site to develop it on. So I think we need to look very carefully at that particular development. Thank you very much, Chair. That's all.
Thank you, Councillor Bartlett. Well, we've given this, I think, a good and fairly robust examination. Could I thank Mr. Shepherd and Mr. Tiffin for the presentation. We will work, as we've said, on a value for money audit to come back as a paper, as an agenda item at a future Audit and Governance Committee meeting. I can't tell you tonight when that will be, because as you know, agendas are pretty packed and this work will take a little bit of time to do, but we will bring it back as soon as it can be prepared. So thank you all very much, and thank you to the other officers for your engagement in this presentation this evening. That moves us on to item 7 on the agenda, which is a review of the organisational and operational structure of BCP Council. Again, this was a member suggestion, strongly supported by me, and I think it was an issue that the Chief Executive was more than happy to bring to us so that he could make a presentation and then take some questions. So, Chief Executive, over to you.
Thank you, Chairman. And I'll share my screen if I can. We did practice this earlier on, so let's just hope this this works. And I'm hoping you should be able to see a slide that just says corporate structures and functions. Has that come up yet? Can anybody confirm? Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Great. Yes. Thanks. Okay. What I thought I'd do is I'll talk through the corporate structure sort of top down, but I thought it's worth just putting it into context of what we're trying to achieve, because it is just worth reminding ourselves that councils are very complex organisations, and we've got a clear strategy. It's got some big challenging tasks to get the community right, to deliver vibrant communities with an outstanding quality of life where everybody plays an active role, and then some really big goals that come under that around creating dynamic places, connected communities, brighter futures, fulfilled lives, and doing that within a sustainable environment. We've now announced our 5 values, so this is intended to be values driven, and as we create this new organisation, we need a management structure and a corporate structure that can help to deliver that at scale, this new scale of 400,000 population. We've then backed that up with a delivery plan, and what we've now articulated are those targets that we need to deliver over the next 3 years. Really, we've been really clear about those and gone public about that. And then the next stage is we've then worked through our operating model and said, what type of council do we want to be? And we've said we want to be a council that is really focused on using data and insight, making as many of our internal services transactional as possible, so as quick and as streamlined as we can, and then building centres of excellence within the council, so that, for example, our HR functions are best in quality, our IT is best in quality, our complaints procedures, for example. So we've got that centres of excellence concept. We're gradually working our way up the diagram. And then what we've said is that wherever we can, we will try and provide automated and digital engagement and services. So that's all about, if, just as an example of an automated rules-based assessment is you put in your postcode, and if you're willing to pay us £40 or £50, then we will provide you with a green bin service. And that's entirely rules-based assessment. You just need to be in the area and be willing to pay money to get the green waste service. Much more complex to do a social care assessment. And we know we can't do those digitally and online, but we're trying to push our services where we can to make them automated and rules-based. We also know we can't deliver our vibrant communities without doing that in strong partnerships with health, with the police. So we have a big job to do in trying to establish those partnerships in order to deliver that overall ambition. So I think it's worth reminding ourselves of those things, because it isn't straightforward, okay, we've got a service to run, let's run the service. We have a much more complex environment than that. Members will have last seen the corporate structure, I think, probably in a public environment. It looked like that. It was 5 blobs for the corporate directorate. So I'm just going to make that a bit more traditional. I was going to make it more traditional, but all the offices have disappeared of those. Can you? Right, okay, I'll go straight to this one. We have 5 directorates, 5 corporate directorates. And these were set up by the Shadow Authority originally, trying to get quite an even spread of weight and of service behind them. So adult social care with 3 service directorates below that, and I'll go into a bit more detail of what each of those does in a minute. So adult social care and health, led by Jan Thurgood. Children's services led by Elaine Redding, and it's worth just reminding ourselves that all 3 children's services for Poole, for Bournemouth and for Dorset have been evaluated as requires improvement. So we know we have to improve that service. I'll come back to some of that in a minute. Regeneration and Economy Directorate with 3 directors, 1 for Destination Culture, 1 for Growth and Infrastructure, 1 for Development, and then an Environment and Communities Directorate looking at housing, environmental services, which includes waste, and communities, which includes antisocial behaviour and regulatory services. So those are the main service delivery departments, and then the corporate director with all the support services in terms of organisational development, IT, finance, and law and governance. I made a slight change when I came in that the second slide without anybody on would have shown how the corporate management board works, which is, it's myself, it's the 5 corporate directors, but it's also the Director of Finance and the Director of Law and Governance. So they have the Section 151 officer and the monitoring officer at all of those decision-making meetings. So that's the current structure. I would hope that members of, this is not working at all. I'm just going to go out of slide presentation. So this is what you should be seeing in a slide format. But when I go to slide format, for some reason, I'm losing all the content of the report. I've never seen that before. I don't know if anybody on the, I think, let me just try something, see if this will work. Okay, that's better. That's showing people. Okay. Sorry, okay, so I'll do this in PowerPoint. If you can see that. Sorry, can somebody just confirm that you can now see a full structure, because I've now lost sight of...
There's nothing there.
It's a blank piece now.
Ah.
Just a black screen, Chief.
That's not helpful at all, is it then? Okay, let me come out of that. So I've managed to get the slide so I could see it, but that's not helpful if you can't. Right, let me go back to... It's a good job we rehearsed this beforehand, wasn't it? No, you can't see anything at all, can you?
No.
Presumably a login screen. Okay, let me try and stop sharing. Second, share a window. And I'll share that window. And then I'll put that onto presentation mode. Now, do you have a slide showing now?
It's loading.
Loading.
Yes, we do. Adult social care.
Social care.
Excellent. Okay, and I've just clicked it back now to show the 5 corporate directors. Can you see that?
That's the corporate and service directorate.
Yes, yes,
whole thing,
yes.
yes.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay. Yeah, so we talked about the corporate director for resources, and that's supporting the organisation. So then on adult social care, I'm hoping you can now see 3 pillars with a bit more detail of what they do. So we have the delivery of adult social care services run by David Vitti. We have the commissioning of adult social care, which is Phil Hornsby. And then we have the public health function, which we actually share with Dorset. But Sam Crowe then reports into Jan Thurgood on that management team. So that's a relatively straightforward structure of delivery, David Vitti, commissioning, and IT, performance management and quality through Phil Hornsby, and then public health alongside that. In children's services, we have a similar sort of setup. It's not as straightforward in that we have social care services, inclusion and family services, and then quality and commissioning. And this is an area, this is the first area where when we recruited externally. So we recruited an external director of children's services, and 2 out of 3 of those service directors were also external appointments. Julian Radcliffe and Jane were both external appointments. Neil Goddard as an internal appointment. So that structure has maintained, but actually what we need to do is to be really clear about where does education sit, where does our relationship with schools sit. So we are currently looking at the boundaries across that, but that was the structure that we ran with. On regeneration economy, it was more clear in the sense that we had, if I look on the right hand side, development, so that's Chris Shepherd running the major capital projects, economic development, and those business related functions around economy. Julie McLaughlin appointed to run growth and infrastructure, which is planning and highways, and transport, building control, also does engineering and coastal protection in there. So growth and infrastructure separate. And then we created the role of destination and culture, which was trying to bring together all those functions that you see there. And I'll come back to my view on that going forward. We did not recruit to that permanently. We tried twice, and we have an interim internal appointment against that at the moment in Chris Saunders. In environment and community, we set up 3 directorates, one for housing, which is more of a traditional director of housing role, one for environment, which is waste management and parks and open spaces, highways maintenance and bereavement services, and one for communities, which I say was regulatory and community development and community safety. And then in resources, just a bit more detail on organisational development. So that includes HR, customer, communications, policy and performance and major change projects. So that's Matty Roudsep. IT, Katie Lacey with all the traditional IT infrastructure and delivery. Finance, as you know, Adam Richards is the Section 151 Officer and Director of Finance. And then law and governance, which is the monitoring officer role, legal, democratic, member services, etc. If I look at that as a structure, I think it served us well. I think it's got us through the initial phase of local government reorganisation. When I look at it in scale, it's actually smaller than the equivalent structure in both of my previous authorities. Either Thurrock currently has 25 people, I believe, in that level, and Barket and Dagenham has a very different structure, but it looks like there's about 50 people at that level or thereabouts. So it is quite a tight structure, although I'd have to say it's probably bigger in senior management terms than either Poole or Bournemouth was. And that's why I emphasise the issue about scale. My view is that when we get to business as usual, we'll be able to refine this structure and reduce the number of people at this level. I'm making some interim changes. So I've consulted with the corporate directors. They've consulted with their service directors as well. And I wanted to flag some changes that we're thinking about making at the moment. They have been delayed due to COVID and the pandemic and needing to respond to that. But for example, Julian Osthorpe will become much more focused on the transformation agenda, will probably become Corporate Director of Transformation, and both Director of Finance and Director of Law and Governance will report directly to me in the way that they do at CMB, and that will allow us to focus much more heft on the Transformation Directorate. I also want to make some changes around regeneration economy to give us much more clarity on place shaping and leading the place of Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole, and also to allow us the capacity to deliver the Transforming Cities Fund and the transport infrastructure investments. There's some discussion around potentially moving some of those functions like seafront and some of those operational functions into environment and community, and splitting out transportation and planning within growth and infrastructure, because they're both big issues for us. And we have to improve our planning performance. We also have a big agenda to deliver on transport. The reason I mentioned the centres of excellence in that operational model earlier on was, if you have a look at communications, it occurs in all of our functions. Everybody has somebody who does communications. We have a big blob in organisation development. We have the corporate communications team. We have quite a big blob in destination and culture, where we have the marketing and tourism team. But actually, there's a bit of communications going on in every directorate. One of the bits of work we did to KPMG, which we reported to the Cabinet, was the idea of saying, actually, we have a lot of resource spread across. Would we get better efficiency if we brought them together? So one of the things we're looking at is using one of the director posts, the Director of Destination and Culture, changing that into a Director of Communications, Marketing and Strategy, and bringing all these communication functions together, and then getting greater operational efficiencies and reducing the cost and the size of that function. So that's an example of one of the things that we're doing now, that we're looking across the council and saying, through that work that we've done, actually we think we could be more efficient in that. So there are some changes that are coming which we're looking at. A longer term, we've been looking at, we've got commissioning in children's, we've got commissioning in adults, we've got procurement in finance. Is that the best way of organising commissioning? Should we be thinking about that? So I've tasked Children's Services, so that's an old slide that's popped up because that should have Elaine Redding's name on. I've tasked both Elaine and Jan to look at, should we be trying to bring their commissioning more closely together. So those are some of the examples of how I see the structure evolving. I do think over time we will see quite an extensive evolution of this structure as we think about the future and the demands on the council. I think there's, if I just stop presenting that for a minute, I think there's probably three phases for us. There was the very short term, let's get over the finish line, let's do local government reorganisation, let's bring these services into one council. We achieved that with notably no major service failures as a result of local government reorganisation and a safe landing for all. The second phase then is to start that reorganisation, starting to bring in those services together and making sure we have harmonised services across the board. We're probably between half and three-quarters of the way through that process, finishing the restructure all the way down to the front line, and then we need to move into more of a BAU, business as usual, function, and that's where I see some further refinement of this structure over the next probably 18 months or so. My sense, my preferred way of doing management restructures is continual evolution. I'd rather continue to evolve the structure into what we want it to be, and I'm pretty certain that what we want it to be in a year or two's time will be different than what we would want today. So I think we're now starting on that evolution. We've probably lost 3 or 4 months due to COVID in that process, but we're now starting to make some of those evolutionary changes to make sure that we have a structure that is both contemporary, so it can react to modern challenges and today's challenges, but also one that is constantly evolving. So I'm hoping that that's helpful to members. Happy to take any questions, happy to discuss any of those sorts of changes. The ones that I talked about in yellow and red are not yet finalised, they're not distributed. We're just saying, okay, those are the next steps that we're now looking at.
Thank you very much indeed, Chief Executive. In the absence of any questions that have come through to me, can I start that off and just ask you, with the experience of the last 6 months with COVID, and the structure that you have in place, but also bearing in mind what you've said about evolution of that structure, have there been any issues that have led you to believe that we should bring forward further changes sooner than we might otherwise have done, or has COVID just been a question of managing the process with what we've got and what we're going to have in the future?
Okay, no, I think there's probably two parts to that answer. I think that the first is that actually I'm glad we've had the capacity that we've had with COVID added on, and we have, I think, collectively coped admirably with a huge set of challenges alongside local government reorganisation. And actually, it's at that point I want to just pay tribute to the staff that, you know, we haven't finished the restructure all the way down. We know we have still some places where we're running 3 different services, and yet they coped tremendously with the challenges of COVID and everything else. I think one of the things it has done, I have to say, is brought us better partnerships with our other public sector agencies. And actually, again, maybe this structure has worked very well in some of those structures. So we've seen on safeguarding, for example, a really good coming together of children's, adults, community safety, health, public health, and police all coming together to look at our safeguarding arrangements for BCP. What that has done is meant that we've broken out of, let's say, some of the Dorset-wide arrangements, because we said we'd rather take a holistic view of safeguarding in the BCP area than have a Dorset-wide view of children's safeguarding separate from a Dorset-wide view of adult safeguarding, separate from a Dorset-wide view of antisocial behaviour. So there's some sacrifice in that. But so I think actually it's sort of helped us with that structure. I think it has changed our thinking about some of the ways forward, and particularly the need to focus on transformation. And, you know, in Julian Osgathorpe, we have an expert in transformation. We have to enable him. to drive us all through the transformation agenda and really change the way that we deliver our services and the way we manage our services. And I think he can do that best if he's really focused on transformation. And I think that will make a difference over the next 6, 9, 12 months as we get on that partner and take that. So I think some learning from COVID, some benefit of the structure within COVID.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Councillor Dunlop.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, I have a question, please. It's about the seafront. I mean, to me, the seafront is one of the most significant pieces of the visitor economy, and certainly in any coastal resort area. And for us, it forms a large part of our economy. I'm just trying to understand the logic of moving it to environment and community, because I just see it as something that is almost quite pivotal to a huge chunk of our visitor economy. And how will that be managed if it's moved to environment community?
So my sense in talking that through is there's a real difference between the seafront strategy, which we don't have, and the delivery of services along the seafront. And I think it's the delivery of services that we're moving. What we need is a single seafront strategy for the BCP area. If you look at the beach app, which has got us fantastic credibility and fantastic coverage, actually it divides the beach into 24 areas. What we don't have is a strategy that knits together all those 24 areas and say, okay, what do we want each area of the beach to be? How do we want to spread? So that's the bit that needs to be in place shaping, absolutely. And our work on tourism as one of those 5 key sector skills, or sectors of the economy that we really focus on skills, absolutely that's got to be in there. Managing the cafes on the seafront, managing the provision of deck chairs, etc. Those are operational functions that need more of an operational focus on, in my view. So that's the thing we're trying to create, is not to say seafront isn't important to the economy, because it's absolutely vital. But to try and differentiate that between the day-to-day operation of some of those parts of our business.
Councillor Cox. Sorry, Councillor Cox.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry, you've probably answered a lot of this already, Graham. You in your presentation, you dealt a lot with evolution. You talked a lot about evolution, but later on in an answer to Councillor Beasley, you talked about transformation. My question was going to be, what is the emphasis here? Is it transformation or is it evolution? They seem to be quite contradictory. Given what's happened with COVID, I thought that we'd learned an awful lot of lessons and ways of working differently, which we were going to pick up on and take forward. And that to me seemed much more transformational rather than evolutionary. And therefore, I just wanted to see what your feelings were on that.
I think what I'm trying to differentiate is a structural solution and the way that we work. And the way that we work has to be transformational, it has to be rapid, it has to be major. And my sense is we've got a long way to go in a very short time, and that's the focus that Julian is going to bring on the transformation of the way that we work. I think on organisational structures, I worry that if you go through a big restructure, you come up with a solution and you move people into their new posts, and that takes a year in an organisation of this sort of scale, 5,500 people. And then you do those major changes, and then everybody has to breathe a sigh of relief and say, phew, that's it, isn't it? But actually it isn't, because next year we know our service demand will be different. We know the patterns of finance will be different. So what I'm trying to create, I think, is a position where the structure is continually evolving, but we absolutely need to rapidly transform the way that we work. And that's the differentiation I think I'm trying to get across. So it is a bit nuanced. It's sort of unsettling for people because they sort of want to think that I work for X and X works for Y and Y works in this directorate and that's what we do, and you get some ownership. But actually the ownership should be to BCP Council, not to a particular directorate or not to a particular section. And again, that whole council approach. We've just been talking to the Children's Services Directorate and saying, actually, if we want to make the sorts of changes that we want to make to improve our services, then they might have to move a couple of functions between them. Somebody at a senior level might have to focus on a single function for a while. That's the sort of evolutionary change I'm looking for. What I am looking for, though, is pace in transformation.
Okay.
Councillor White.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Graham, that was a really, really very helpful summary. It's really quite a small point that I'd like to make, and that is the suggestion that it would be very helpful as a councillor to have an organisation chart that goes a further level down in terms of officer names. I mean, frankly, it would save me and I think a lot of other members sending things direct to your service directors or even strategic directors or even yourself. It would be great to have another level on that chart with names on it. Thank you.
That's a really valid point, and actually we should do that, not only a structure chart for individuals but also for functions, so that you've got clarity of the way in. I think we'll follow that up. Yeah.
Thank you for that suggestion, Councillor White. It's really useful. Councillor Butt.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chief, for your explanation and great presentation for today. Just a quick thing that Beverly Dunlop picked up on regards to the coast. I believe in the transformation, from what I've seen so far, only covers Sandbanks to Hengistbury Head. Yes. And in the beach app as well, I believe it has missed out Hamworthy, which we've obviously got Rockley Park as a massive tourism caravan park. Water sports, etc. Will this then be included in the transformation plan?
I did see an explanation of that at one point, which was sort of convincing, but actually we need to evolve it to include those areas. I think the explanation was because our seafront ranges and seafront services only go from Sandbanks to Highcliffe effectively, then we had up-to-date information, regular information to update it. I think the answer is we have to find an equivalent way of doing it for Hamworthy and for the other areas as well. So we are onto that. At the moment, that beach app is effectively manually coloured in because it's done by people going out, having a look at the beach and then reporting back levels of traffic, levels of population, etc., and then it getting updated virtually manually. We have to have that availability across in Hamworth as well. But we've received, I think it's about £36,000 of extra funding from MHCLG, the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, to continue to upgrade the app, and hopefully we'll build that in at that point.
Thank you.
Leader of the Council, Councillor Slade.
Thank you, Councillor Beasley. A couple of things on that. Just briefly on the beach app, that is correct. It is to do with the fact that they are managed beaches. They have rangers, they have lifeguards, they have facilities. They're also, the purpose of the beach app was around social distancing and people coming to the area, and the management, although it's currently manual, it's hopefully going to be moving to CCTV and footfall monitors, and they're not things which are likely to be done at Hamworthy or Rockley. Bear with me just a second. Isaac, I need you now. Sorry, I currently have a missing child, so Andrew said yes, she is. Okay, thank you. Okay. The other issue that I actually put the RTS for was that I've already been working with Matty, who's the director within the resources team, and Lisa Cotton, who's the head of customer services, on the next level down of the organisational chart. That is due to be delivered to us within the next sort of 14 days or so, because we know that members have been particularly having difficulty in knowing quite who sits where. I was hoping to be able to deliver you that link by tomorrow, but it may slip to next week. So that piece of work is already almost complete, so that members are able to fully understand where the organisational chart sits.
Well, thank you for that, because I think we'll all save a lot of time and energy once we've got that, actually. So very, very welcome.
Maybe we're saying, Chairman, alongside that, the leader and I have been talking about giving councillors a sort of a guaranteed complaints route. So if you've got an issue to raise, we'll give you a central email address. You can send the things into there, and then we will chase them through and track them and confirm that they've been dealt with. So we'll hopefully offer those two things side by side.
That should lead to a removal of quite a lot of frustration from members, I suspect.
I recognise that.
I just, I wonder, Chief Executive, just taking the opportunity, whether there was anything to this item that perhaps Julian Osgathorpe from the transformation side might be able to add, because you've referred several times to that, and it just might be useful for members to hear from him.
Very, very happy to bring Julian in for him to talk through. Julian.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Graham. I bearing in mind it's 20 to 8, giving me a blank canvas might be quite a dangerous thing to do at this point.
I emphasise the words I used, which were just hasty comments. We'll bring you back for something wider on a future occasion, of course.
I think I would echo everything Graham has said. The only possible kind of elaboration I would make in the absence of any specific questions was on the point about the difference between evolution and transformation, and in particular in the wake of the experience over the last 5 or 6 months with COVID. And I think what the words I've been using with my colleagues a lot over the last 2 years is there's a difference between a transition and transformation. And what we have to understand very clearly as an organization, we are incredibly large, we're incredibly complex. We are in the history of the last generation of local authorities, we are completely unique. And there is an awful lot that we have to fix, and some of it will take quite a lot of time. But in the short term, while we're transforming that stuff, there are still changes that we can and should make that are transitional in nature. And I think, as Graham said, it is nuanced, it is difficult to get your head around sometimes. But a really practical example of that is the perception that as a result of COVID, we have rapidly transformed the way we work. And in many ways, that is absolutely true. But below the surface, while we appear to be working quite differently, all of the problems that we had, or many of the problems, the vast majority of the problems that we had around our technology, around our office availability, around our kit, all of those still exist, and we're kind of making it work, but it is not sustainable and it is not optimized from a cost perspective. And one of the key purposes of doing transformation is to remove significant amounts of cost from the budget of this organization. So members, the plea from me is that we need to work really hard organizationally as colleagues to understand the difference between the two T words, transition and transformation, and we will be doing both continually over the next several years.
Thank you very much, Mr. Osgathorpe. That's helpful. I haven't had any indication from other members wishing to speak, so I'd like to draw this to a close. I've had a message from Democratic Services suggesting circulation of the slides to the committee, which I think we would welcome if that could be done, please. And they will be useful to go and work through and refresh our memories after this evening's meeting. Could I say a big thank you to the Chief Executive for the presentation he's given to us. I know you've had to move a few things around this evening to enable that to take place. That is appreciated. Thank you very much indeed. And I suspect that on a future occasion, sometime in the future, we would welcome an update from you, probably not the full presentation, but I think that would be very helpful for us to keep in touch.
Very happy to do that, Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chief Executive. That completes the business of the meeting this evening. Could I thank all the officers who've taken part? I found it very useful. I'm sure members of the committee have as well. Thank you also to members of the committee for making this a full house tonight. It does reflect the level of interest that we've all got in these topics. and of course you as members of the committee no doubt will bring forward other items which we can consider for presentations again in the future. So thank you very much indeed to one and all. And just before I bid you good night, could I ask Mr. Jones to confirm when he stops the live stream of the meeting?